The sky over Cedar Falls had worn a strange greenish cast for 3 straight afternoons that July, a color the county's older farmers recognized well enough from experience, even if none of them could properly explain what caused it. A heaviness settling into the air each afternoon that made livestock restless and left grown men glancing upward with an unease they rarely bothered voicing aloud. Hail was no stranger to this particular stretch of county. Ordinary summer storms delivering their usual scattered pelting most years, without doing more than bruising a garden's tomatoes or rattling a few loose shingles. Nobody in Cedar Falls, watching that peculiar green-tinged sky through the middle of July, imagined the county was approaching something considerably worse than ordinary. Thaddeus Byrne had been watching that sky more carefully than anyone else in the valley, and by the time the first real warning signs arrived, he had already spent the better part of 2 months doing something that made him, for that entire difficult summer, the most talked about man in Cedar Falls. He was rebuilding his own barn roof out of woven willow, not patching it, not simply reinforcing the existing cedar shakes the way any sensible carpenter, facing an uncertain hail season, might have chosen to do, but tearing the whole roof down to its rafters and replacing it entirely with a dense, tightly interlaced lattice of willow branches, harvested by the wagon load from the creek bottoms and woven strand over strand into a flexible covering, unlike anything Cedar Falls had ever seen attempted on a proper structure. He worked at it alone through the early summer mornings, before the day's heat made the willow too brittle to bend properly, moving across the rafters with the particular slow, deliberate care of a man whose damaged leg would not forgive a careless misstep. "Man's building himself a basket big enough to live under," said Jasper Higgins, whose own prosperous farm sat just across the road from Thaddeus's modest carpentry shop and barn. Laughing to a gathered group of neighbors one hot June afternoon, as they watched Thaddeus work slowly across his rafters, Kane hooked over a nearby beam within easy reach. "Fine work for baskets and chicken coops, I'll grant him that much skill. But willow branches for a roof over his own barn, in a county that sees hail most every summer? Man's finally let that bad leg addle whatever carpentry sense he had left." The talk in Cedar Falls that summer carried a particular unkindness sharpened by the fact that Thaddeus Byrne had, before his accident 6 years earlier, been widely regarded as the finest carpenter working within 2 counties, a reputation that made his current strange project seem, to more than a few of his neighbors, like proof of exactly how far a good man's judgment could decline once his body had failed him. Thaddeus heard most of the mockery second-hand, carried to him through the steady stream of clients who still sought out his skilled hands for furniture and fine joinery work, even as they openly questioned his judgment about his own barn roof, though enough of it reached him directly that he had long since developed the particular patient silence of a man who had learned exactly how little most people's opinions changed once they'd settled comfortably into mockery. The truth of Thaddeus Byrne's strange devotion to woven willow reached back 6 years, to a town called Kettle Creek, nearly 100 miles east, where Thaddeus had once worked as a young, ambitious carpenter building barns and homes across a rapidly growing county, before a single, terrible afternoon changed the whole shape of his life and his understanding of what a roof actually needed to survive. He had been working that particular summer on a large new barn for one of Kettle Creek's most prosperous ranchers, high up on the rafters, fitting cedar shakes in the ordinary manner every carpenter in the region had always used, when a sudden violent hailstorm rolled in with almost no warning, across a sky that had, in hindsight, carried exactly the same peculiar green cast Cedar Falls now wore. The hail that afternoon fell in stones the size of a grown man's fist, a scale of destruction Kettle Creek's oldest residents said they had never witnessed before or since, and Thaddeus, caught exposed on the rafters with nowhere safe to shelter, took a direct crushing blow to his left leg from a falling roof beam knocked loose by the storm's fury before he could climb to safety, an injury that left him with a permanent limp and a leg too weakened for the kind of sustained physical labor his trade had always demanded. The barn itself, along with nearly every other conventional roof across Kettle Creek, was destroyed entirely that afternoon, cedar shakes shattered and driven clean through in places by hailstones whose size and force the region's ordinary building methods had never been designed to withstand. Thaddeus spent the following months recovering from his injury in a modest room above Kettle Creek's general store, his carpentry career seemingly finished before it had properly begun, filling the long, frustrating weeks of his recovery with whatever small, seated work his weakened leg still allowed him to manage. He remembered the accident itself with a clarity that 6 years had done little to dull, the sudden, deafening roar of the hail's arrival, drowning out even his own shouted warning to the two younger apprentices working the rafters beside him, the sickening crack of the roof beam giving way overhead, and the long, disorienting moment of falling, before the world resolved itself into white-hot pain, and the particular sound of his own leg breaking beneath the beam's weight. The two apprentices had managed to drag him clear before the roof's final collapse, and he had spent the following hours drifting in and out of consciousness while Kettle, Creek's single overworked doctor, worked to set a fracture considerably worse than anything the town's modest medical resources were equipped to properly treat. The leg healed eventually, but it healed wrong, leaving him with a permanent limp and a weakness that no amount of subsequent care ever fully resolved. It was during that difficult recovery that Thaddeus first noticed something the rest of grieving. Rebuilding Kettle Creek had entirely overlooked in the chaos of the storm's aftermath. A modest chicken coop belonging to an elderly German immigrant named Otto Reinhold, roofed not with conventional cedar shakes, but with a dense woven covering of willow branches. Otto had built himself using techniques carried from the old country, stood entirely undamaged amid a town otherwise flattened by the same catastrophic storm. Thaddeus, hobbling past the Reinhold property on his crutches during one of his first difficult outings after the injury, had stopped to examine the coop's roof with a carpenter's careful, curious attention, and had found himself unable to explain, at first, exactly why a structure built from such modest, seemingly flimsy material had survived a disaster that shattered roofs built from far sturdier conventional lumber. Otto Reinhold, delighted to find a young man genuinely curious about a technique most of his American neighbors had always dismissed as quaint old-world eccentricity, spent that autumn teaching Thaddeus everything he knew about woven willow construction, a skill Otto had learned as a boy in a German farming village where hailstorms of considerable severity were common enough, that his own grandfather had perfected the technique across decades of careful trial and adjustment. Rigid wood shatters because it has nowhere to send the force of the blow, Otto explained, working alongside Thaddeus at a careful pace that accommodated the younger man's weakened leg, the two of them seated on stools weaving practice sections of willow lattice through the long autumn evenings. Hail strikes a cedar shake dead center, and the whole board must either hold entirely or crack entirely, having no give left in the wood to absorb what it cannot resist outright. Willow, woven properly, flexes beneath each blow, spreading the force across the whole lattice rather than concentrating it in one brittle point. It will not stop every stone from striking through in the very worst storms, but it survives what shatters ordinary lumber, and my grandfather buried considerably fewer neighbors under collapsed roofs than the villages that mocked his methods ever managed. Thaddeus absorbed Otto's careful teaching across that entire autumn and winter, finding in the work itself an unexpected gift beyond the practical knowledge Otto offered him. Willow weaving required patience and careful hand strength, rather than the sustained climbing and heavy lifting his damaged leg could no longer reliably provide, and by the time his recovery finally allowed him to resume something resembling his old trade, Thaddeus had discovered an entirely new specialty that his injury, rather than ending his carpentry career, had unexpectedly redirected him toward. He left Kettle Creek 2 years later, after Otto Reinhold's own death from a winter illness, carrying west with him both his old friend's careful teaching and a private, hard-won understanding of exactly what kind of storm a county's ordinary buildings could not reliably survive. He settled eventually in Cedar Falls, building a modest but respected carpentry business, focused on fine furniture and joinery work that his weakened leg could manage without excessive strain, and though he occasionally mentioned Otto's willow weaving technique to curious clients, he had never before this particular summer felt the same unmistakable warning in Cedar Falls sky that had once, too late, caught him exposed on a Kettle Creek rooftop. That warning arrived in early June, when Thaddeus noticed the county's cattle growing unusually restless through several consecutive humid afternoons, and when a neighbor's dog, normally placid, took to a nervous, whining agitation each time the sky began building toward its now familiar greenish cast. He remembered with a clarity that still occasionally visited him in dreams 6 years later, the exact quality of light that had hung over Kettle Creek in the hours before the storm that took his leg, and when Cedar Falls' sky began repeating that same particular heaviness through the early weeks of that summer. Thaddeus made his decision without expecting anyone in the valley to understand or believe him. He began tearing down his own barn's cedar shake roof in the second week of June, working alone through the cooler morning hours with the same careful, unhurried patience Otto Reinhold had once taught him, hauling willow branches up from the creek bottom by the wagon load and weaving them, strand over careful strand, into a covering that drew Cedar Falls' considerable curiosity, and, increasingly through that long summer, its considerable mockery. Jasper Higgins remained the loudest voice against the project, stopping by Thaddeus's property with almost weekly regularity to offer fresh commentary on what he considered a once-respected carpenter's embarrassing decline. "Whole county knows your work, or knew it before whatever happened to that leg of yours addled your judgment along with it," Jasper told him one particularly hot afternoon in early July, watching Thaddeus work steadily across his half-finished roof. "Man builds a proper roof from proper lumber. This willow foolishness might suit an old German's chicken coop, but you're asking a whole barn to survive on it, and I'd wager good money you'll be rebuilding it proper before the season's out. Once the first real hail this county sees teaches you what the rest of us already know." Thaddeus considered the comment a long moment before answering, his hands never pausing in their careful, practiced weaving. "I've seen what proper lumber does against a real hailstorm, Jasper. Seen it firsthand, close enough that I still carry the proof of it in this leg every single day. You're welcome to your proper roof. I mean to have a barn still standing whichever way this summer decides to go." Constance Marsh, a widow whose modest farm sat along the road between Thaddeus's shop and Jasper Higgins's larger property, proved among the few in Cedar Falls willing to seriously entertain what Thaddeus was attempting, having employed his fine joinery work often enough across the years since her husband's death to trust his judgment considerably more than most of the valley's casual gossip credited him with deserving. She found him one afternoon in late June, resting on an overturned crate beside his half-finished roof, and asked him plainly what exactly had convinced him to risk both his reputation and his own barn on so unconventional a method. "Because I watched a town flatten in under 20 minutes once, Mrs. Marsh," Thaddeus told her, the words costing him something considerable to say aloud after years of keeping the particular grief of that Kettle Creek afternoon mostly to himself. "Watched cedar shakes shatter clean through on roofs built by carpenters twice as skilled as I ever was, while an old immigrant's chicken coop, roofed in nothing grander than woven willow, stood there afterward without so much as a broken twig. I've got the leg to prove which method actually survived that storm, and I'd rather Cedar Falls laugh at my roof for one uncertain summer than bury neighbors under collapsed barns, the way Kettle Creek very nearly did." Constance said little in response beyond a thoughtful nod, but she returned the following week with her own modest wagon load of willow branches, harvested from her property's creek bottom, offering the material without comment, beyond a simple willingness to help however her limited carpentry skill allowed. It was a small gesture, but it marked the beginning of what would, across that difficult summer, become Thaddeus's only real ally in a valley otherwise united in gentle, persistent mockery of his strange, unglamorous project. Thaddeus finished the barn's new willow roof in the third week of July, standing back on his cane to survey a covering that looked, to most passing eyes, considerably less impressive than the neat cedar shakes it had replaced, a dense but modest lattice that bore none of the crisp, orderly appearance Cedar Falls residents expected from proper carpentry. He said nothing further to Jasper Higgins or the valley's other skeptics about his reasoning, content to let the roof itself eventually answer whatever questions his neighbors continued raising at his expense. The hailstorm arrived on the 2nd of August, with almost no meaningful warning beyond the same peculiar greenish sky that had been building on and off through the whole of that unusual summer. The temperature dropped sharply within the storm's first minutes, and the hail that began falling grew within a quarter hour, from ordinary pea-sized pellets into stones the size of a man's closed fist, driven by a wind fierce enough to strip leaves clean from the high county's oldest trees and send loose livestock scrambling for whatever shelter they could find. Cedar Falls endured roughly 18 minutes of that catastrophic hail, a duration brief enough that some of the valley's older residents would later say they could scarcely believe the scale of destruction a storm so short had managed to produce. Cedar shake roofs across the county shattered under the barrage, in exactly the manner Otto Reinhold had once described to Thaddeus, brittle wood cracking and splintering under direct, concentrated blows it had no capacity to absorb or redistribute, entire barn roofs collapsing inward, under the combined weight of broken shingles and the hailstones that continued pounding through the resulting gaps. Jasper Higgins lost his barn roof entirely within the storm's first 10 minutes, standing in his own doorway, watching in helpless disbelief as hailstones the size of his fist tore through cedar shakes he had always considered among the finest and most carefully maintained in the county, the whole structure groaning and finally partially collapsing under a combined assault of wind and ice that left 3 of his prized breeding horses badly injured beneath the falling debris. Across the wider county, similar scenes repeated themselves at farm after farm, conventional roofs failing in rapid succession under a storm whose severity Cedar Falls' collective memory held no reliable comparison for. Thaddeus Byrne's own barn, roofed entirely in Otto Reinholdt's woven willow lattice, held through the whole 18-minute assault with a resilience that stunned even Thaddeus himself, watching from his own doorway as hailstones battered the flexible covering without producing the catastrophic shattering failure visible at nearly every other farm within sight. The willow bent and absorbed each impact exactly as Otto had once described, individual stones occasionally punching small, localized gaps through the lattice's weaker points, but the roof as a whole held its structural integrity throughout, sheltering the livestock and stored equipment beneath it without the wholesale collapse. Devastating conventional roofs across the rest of the county, the scale of destruction that greeted Cedar Falls in the storm's immediate aftermath left the valley's residents struggling to process losses on a scale the county had never previously experienced. Nearly every barn roof across Cedar Falls had suffered severe damage or outright collapse, livestock injured or killed by falling debris at farm after farm, gardens and crops flattened entirely beneath the relentless pounding of fist-sized ice. Jasper Higgins himself spent the storm's immediate aftermath tending to his injured horses with a grim, exhausted focus that left little room for his earlier confident mockery. The collapsed remains of his prized cedar shake roof scattered across his barnyard in splintered testament to exactly the kind of failure Thaddeus had spent an entire summer trying, without success, to warn his neighbors against. Reverend Elias Ford, who had ministered to Cedar Falls' modest congregation for nearly 20 years, spent the days following the storm moving from devastated farm to devastated farm, offering what comfort and practical assistance his own limited resources allowed a valley suddenly confronted with losses few families had the savings to easily absorb. He would later describe that week, in a letter to a fellow minister in a neighboring county, as the closest thing to a genuine disaster his long ministry had witnessed. Families sleeping in wagon beds beside collapsed barns, livestock wandering injured and confused across fields, stripped bare of every crop that had promised, only days before a comfortable autumn harvest. It was Constance Marsh who first rode out to check on Thaddeus's property, once the worst of the storm had passed, finding his barn standing largely intact, amid a county otherwise devastated, its willow roof scarred and punctured in places but fundamentally whole, sheltering his own modest livestock without a single serious injury. She found Thaddeus already at work assessing the minor repairs the roof required, and though the moment offered little room for triumph, given the scale of suffering visible across the rest of the county, she could not help but note aloud exactly what the contrast represented. Whole valleys' roofs came down around them. "Thaddeus," she said, studying the willow lattice's scattered small punctures with newfound respect. "Yours is still standing, and still needing considerable repair," Thaddeus answered, though something in his tired voice carried, for the first time in months, a measure of quiet vindication he made no particular effort to hide. "Willow bends. It doesn't promise to come through unmarked. But there's a considerable difference between a roof that needs mending and a roof that's collapsed entirely onto whatever it was meant to shelter." Word of Thaddeus's surviving willow roof spread through devastated Cedar Falls within days, carried by neighbors surveying their own ruined barns, and struggling to understand how one property, built by the same widely mocked carpenter the whole county had spent an entire summer laughing at, had weathered a storm that flattened structures built by considerably more conventional methods. Jasper Higgins himself, standing amid the wreckage of his own barn roof with 3 injured horses, requiring expensive veterinary care he could ill afford after the storm's broader damage to his farm, rode out to Thaddeus's property in the storm's second week, his earlier confident mockery entirely absent from his exhausted, humbled bearing. "Didn't expect to be asking you this," Jasper admitted, standing in Thaddeus's yard, studying the willow roof's scattered repairs, with an attention he had never previously extended the technique. "But I've got a barn to rebuild, and considerably less money to rebuild it proper than I had before this storm took half my herd's shelter, and 3 good horses besides. Might you teach a man Otto Reinholdt's old method, even one who spent a whole summer laughing at it?" Thaddeus did not make him wait long for an answer, understanding well enough, from his own hard years since Kettle Creek, exactly how costly pride could prove against a lesson a man had already been forced to learn the hard way. "Wasn't looking to be right at your expense, Jasper," he said simply. Come by tomorrow morning. There's considerable willow along the creek bottom, and considerably more county needing rebuilt roofs than one crippled carpenter can manage weaving alone. The rebuilding of Cedar Falls consumed the whole of that difficult remaining summer and autumn, Thaddeus teaching the willow weaving technique to a steady stream of farmers whose own conventional roofs had failed so catastrophically against the storm that even the valley's most stubborn skeptics found little room left for continued doubt. The work proved slow and labor-intensive compared to conventional shake roofing, requiring considerably more patience than most of Cedar Falls's farmers were accustomed to investing in ordinary barn construction. But the alternative, as farm after farm's collapsed roof made plain, was rebuilding with methods the county's own hard experience had just demonstrated could not reliably survive its worst summer. Storm's Reverend Ford himself proved among the technique's most valuable early advocates, having witnessed firsthand across that difficult week of pastoral visits exactly how thoroughly the storm had vindicated Thaddeus's mocked judgment, and he made a point, in the weeks that followed, of speaking to the technique's merits from his own modest pulpit, framing the crippled carpenter's patient foresight as a lesson in humility the whole congregation would do well to carry forward into future seasons. It was not, he told his gathered congregation one difficult Sunday that August, the confident and conventionally skilled who had proven wisest that summer, but the quiet, injured man the valley had too readily dismissed. A lesson, Reverend Ford suggested, carried weight well beyond the narrow matter of roofing technique alone. Constance Marsh became, across that busy rebuilding season, something close to Thaddeus's full working partner, her own growing skill at the willow weaving technique, freeing him to focus his still limited physical stamina on the more demanding sections of each new roof, while she managed the steady, patient work his damaged leg could no longer sustain across full working days. The two of them, along with a growing circle of Cedar Falls farmers who had spent that difficult August learning Otto Reinhold's careful old-world technique, rebuilt nearly 24 barn roofs across the county before the following spring, each one bearing the same dense, flexible willow lattice that had once seemed to a valley confident in its own conventional wisdom, like proof of a crippled carpenter's declining judgment, rather than the hard-won knowledge of a man who had already paid, in his own injured leg, for exactly the lesson Cedar Falls needed to learn. Thaddeus Byrne lived out the remainder of his long career in Cedar Falls as the county's most sought-after carpenter, his old reputation for fine conventional joinery work, now joined by an equally respected mastery of Otto Reinhold's willow weaving technique that outlasted, by decades, the particular summer that had finally taught an entire valley to take his strange, mocked judgment seriously. He kept for the rest of his working life a small section of unfinished willow lattice hanging on his workshop wall, a private reminder of an old German immigrant's patient teaching and a Kettle Creek storm that had cost him a healthy leg but had ultimately given him, in exchange, the particular knowledge that saved an entire county, the exact grief he had once carried home from that terrible rooftop alone.